President Cyril Ramaphosa, along with other African leaders, are expected to travel to Russia and Ukraine to meet with their presidents, Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. This is an attempt to broker peace after over a year of fighting after Russia invaded its neighbor last February. Now, it's believed that President Putin has welcomed the initiative. Let's talk about all of this now with Gustavo De Carvalho, senior researcher with the South African Institute of International Affairs. A very good afternoon to you, sir. Grateful for your time. So, from the post-cab briefing today, or in this week, excuse me, by the Minister, Kumbuzo Nchabeni, one of the things that came up possibly as a role that South Africa would want to maybe play is even hosting a summit aimed at bringing the conflict to an end. Is that viable at this stage?
I think at this stage we should be skeptical about those ideas. We've seen earlier this week with the counteroffensive that Ukraine has been doing on the ground, but particularly after the explosion of the dam of Novokakhovka dam, all of those create a very difficult scenario for a serious conversation between Ukraine and Russia. Nevertheless, it is very important for us to see the opportunity, I think, for African states to increase the channels of communications. We know a conflict like this will take a long time to be resolved, but it can potentially be beneficial for African states trying to present a narrative of an alternative of solution and providing an alternative of a space for dialogue. So in that sense, it's quite important, especially when we see the configuration of countries going into that visit. Some of the countries have voted in favor of condemning the Russian invasion, and some other countries, as we know, like South Africa, have abstained from those. So having that variety of African countries into the visit is definitely a very positive step and something that we should be watching with interest.
So, and Minister Nchabeni was clear to say that that's not what is on the table at the moment, but Pretoria would be keen to host such talks if indeed things moved in that direction. But when there were the earlier interventions, none of the people who tried to intervene long ago, as 2022, were able to bring Putin and Zelensky into the same room. What would it take for Ramaphosa and the rest of the African delegation to get this to that point?
That is definitely the most difficult part of the process, and I would say potentially bringing to the two parties that a negotiation is beneficial for both. I think that certainly the space that mediators and political figures like the heads of states that are going to Ukraine and Russia are important, but certainly all of those are tied to what happens in the terrain. If either of the parties believe that a negotiation will make them lose more than they're willing to compromise, then it would be quite difficult. So I think what is important now for us to see is not necessarily a quick fix from African heads of states, but particularly opening the channel of dialogue. I think that in itself is a very important step towards a potential conflict resolution in Ukraine.
And is Africa, I wonder, the most, shall we say, for want of a better phrase, trustworthy of the regions of the world as far as trying to bring this conflict to an end, just when you consider how much the West has been involved through NATO, for instance?
I think for African countries is a very good opportunity in terms of showcasing. I think many African countries have shown a certain degree of proximity with Russia, but particularly showing that this non-aligned position that many African countries are putting forward, it's actually what is happening. So I think the dialogue with the Ukrainian counterparts, with the Russian counterparts, African countries already have quite an open dialogue with Russia, and which will be exemplified in July now with the Russia-Africa Summit in St. Petersburg. So what African countries can provide is that opportunity of a more open channel of dialogue, which we've seen that Western countries have not been able to do, especially with the sanctions and the very close and a very difficult relationship between Russia and NATO at the moment. So we could definitely find some opportunities for African states, but I think it's certainly they would require a lot of effort and a lot of political will to ensure that these countries are indeed seen and perceived as impartial in that position and being able to really talk to both parties equally.
But are South Africa, Uganda, Egypt, Senegal, and the others who will be part of this delegation, are they really non-aligned? And what does non-aligned really mean at a time when there's active warfare between two nations and one, Russia, has its military present in the territory of another sovereign state?
I think it's an important question, and I think it's important for us to reflect that the non-aligned positions don't necessarily mean that they are neutral to the particular conflict. I think what we have seen in many countries in the global south, and majority of countries in the global south, trying to distance themselves somehow from the conflict and to a certain degree continue interacting with different parties. I think there is a understanding, or should be an understanding, that the invasion of Ukraine is illegal according to international law, but also countries are looking to find alternative ways that don't necessarily put them as perceived and seen as one of the belligerent parties. The problem, I think, particularly for countries like South Africa, hasn't been necessarily the statement that the country is non-aligned. I think the problem for a country like South Africa and some of the other countries you mentioned is that their non-aligned position has been very confusing, and there has been a lot of mixed signals within that space. And I think that it's something that is important to address in the strip, to showcase really what it is, and to have a foreign policy and a position towards the situation that is much more clear than what it has been before. And I think if we are able to get that, we should be able to get quite an important victory for the country in terms of positioning itself in a way that is not necessarily just seen as an ally of Russia, but rather as a credible counterpart that indeed can bring the different parties together.
How much of a complication is the warrant for Putin's arrest in any efforts, for example, to get him and Zelensky around a table in a quote-unquote neutral venue?
We've already seen the complication happening very vividly when it comes to the hosting of the BRICS summit in South Africa in August. And we certainly will see from countries like South Africa, signatory of the Rome Statute, and in principle obliged to arrest Vladimir Putin if he comes to South Africa. I think in reality, the political discussions around that will probably trump any legal discussion at this stage. And I'm not necessarily advocating for that, but I think with the reality right now, we should expect that this to continue being, as it has been, more of a political discussion than a legal one.
And do you expect then, Gustavo, that ultimately, even though government is receiving advice on this, South Africa will have to cede BRICS summit hosting rights to China in August?
It is a possibility. We haven't heard any confirmation as yet, and I think we're still working around many rumors that have existed, and especially in the last 2 weeks. If South Africa is willing to avoid the legal crisis that the visit of Vladimir Putin would create, that would be a natural option for the country. But I think we're yet to see what the next steps from government will be. We know that President Ramaphosa has had conversations earlier this week with President Putin, but also with President Xi Jinping. So some of those discussions and those decisions need to be taken very fast. We're talking about a very large summit where the 5 member states are going to be bringing very large delegations. So South Africa doesn't have a lot of time left in terms of making its final decision and to potentially resolve a really problematic legal crisis if we happen to have that in the country.
Gustavo De Carvalho, Senior Researcher with the South African Institute of International Affairs. A pleasure to speak to you. Thank you for your time.